Ladies and gentlemen, early in the year I was invited to give this Gresham Lecture as part of the 2011 City of London Festival, with its strong accent on Australian and New Zealand music. I hurriedly penned the abstract, and I quote, "We can think of world-leading Australians in sport, Don Bradman, media ownership, Rupert Murdoch, and film, Nicole Kidman. In music, some great performers come to mind, especially female singers, Nellie Melba, Joan Sutherland. But how many people can even name an Australian composer?" In his Gresham Lecture, Malcolm Gilles probes this elusive category of greatness. Percy Grainger, the composer of Country Gardens, is often mentioned as a contender. But despite his birth, was he really Australian? Was he primarily a composer? And what was so great about him anyway? If I'd been writing that abstract today, I might have begun, "It is hard to avoid world-leading Australians. In media ownership, Rupert Murdoch. In media ownership, James Murdoch. And in media ownership, Rebecca Brooks, who seems over the last 100 hours to have gained the pariah status of an honorary Australian." Mind you, the Australian press during these days, at least the bit of it that isn't owned by Rupert Murdoch, is stressing very heavily that Rupert Murdoch actually these days carries an American passport, and that his son, incidentally born in Wimbledon, has been corrupted by, quote, "the speak of the North American Business School," unquote. National generalisations about character abound. Can I just mention two names to make my point? Strauss-Kahn and Berlusconi. As people like Rupert help to turn our world into a truly global 24/7 village, these character generalisations seem only to intensify. In her book about spas, Cathedrals of the Flesh, of 2003, Alexia Brew probed the attributes of a modern European she found sitting next to herself on a plane. She commented, "He combines the moral courage of the French, the fighting spirit of the Italians, the work ethic of the British, and the sense of humour of the Germans. In short, he turned out to be a Belgian." Australians, on the other hand, currently appear to have none of these European deficiencies. Indeed, the nation was founded, or if you prefer, invaded, by those in flight from these European qualities, or who were even compulsorily exported from these shores. A recent special report on Australia by The Economist magazine on the 28th of May was pithily entitled, "No Worries?" And it concluded, "That Australia is successful is not in doubt. It has a prospering economy, an harmonious and egalitarian society, an ability to accommodate immigrants, an excellent civil service, an independent central bank, a good balance of personal freedom and limited government, sensible pension arrangements, sporting prowess, and a fine cuisine." And after this long eulogistic advertorial, The Economist dares to comment that the current lot of Australian politicians, quote, "couldn't pull the skin off a rice pudding," unquote. Now, amid this thoroughly upbeat 20-page analysis of Australia's current circumstance in The Economist, something is missing. The arts don't get a mention. Wine, yes. Sport, yes. Minerals, yes. Money, lots of yes. The environment, yes. Sheep, yes. Even Vegemite. The arts, no. Even although an Australian dot-painted boomerang appears on the opening page, there are no words about it. It is just a graphic. Although there are some buried lines later on about the Aborigines and their continuing plight. Why is it that we can think of Australian sportsmen And if you've forgotten about the long-dead Don Bradman, well then you probably recall the cricket and texting hero Shane Warne. Or that brace of Rod Laver, Roy Emerson and John Newcombe that won virtually every Wimbledon male final between 1960 and 1970. And think of film stars, not just Nicole Kidman or Kate Blanchett, but also Mel Gibson. Or perhaps you'd prefer to think of social activists such as Germaine Greer or Geoffrey Robertson. But then, look at the people featured on the plastic notes of the Australian currency, now, by the way, the 5th most traded currency in the world, and you see a different Australia. Dame Mary Gilmore, poet and journalist. David Unaipon, Aboriginal writer and inventor and journalist. Banjo Patterson, poet and journalist. And Dame Nellie Melba, singer and journalist. No, sorry, she was just a singer. 4 out of the 9 featured personalities on the currency notes have artistic or literary claims to fame. And who, by the way, you may be thinking are the other 5 who are featured on the currency notes. Well, coming in at $100 is General Sir John Monash. At $50, Edith Cowan, Australia's first female parliamentarian, and both of those have now actually become universities. At $10, you have Flying Doctor John Flynn and Mary Reeby, a convict turned shipping magnate turned philanthropist. And at an absolute snitch of $5, Her Majesty the Queen. The balance of 5 women as against 4 men would, I suggest, not be found on too many currencies around the world. But note that there wasn't a sports person in sight. Now, out of those 9, the one you have probably heard of, other than the Queen, of course, is Nellie Melba, which reminds us that Australians have been prominent as musical performers. Think also of the late Sir Charles Mackerras. But they've been prominent particularly as female vocalists. Let's not forget the recently departed Joan Sutherland, but also the indefatigable Kylie Minogue. But what of composers? Like Sweden, Switzerland, or Canada, it is hard for many music lovers immediately to name an Australian composer. I once tried this out at a conference of the International Musicological Society with a group of people with very wide and, one hopes, fairly deep knowledge of music. And after much feet shuffling and hesitation, the name Percy Grainger emerged. But like Rupert Murdoch, the comment immediately followed, wasn't he really American? Or like Nellie Melba, he didn't actually live there, did he? Now, you might, in fact, why don't we do it right now? Can you name for me a Canadian composer? 7th largest economy in the world? Who's putting their hand up? Say? Yes? Anyone else? Okay, anyone else? I make my point. It's pretty difficult. I would have said Ernest Macmillan going back a little while, but it's very hard sometimes with countries that are hugely prominent now economically or even culturally, some of them to actually name a composer. So who was Percy Grainger? Was he Australian? Was he any good as a composer? Was he really great? Indeed, has Australia even had a greatest composer? By coming here today, there is some evidence to suggest that you already know something about Grainger or his music. But let me give you a micro summary. You could call it a Grainger tweet. Composer and pianist. Born Melbourne, 1882. Died New York, 1961. Trained, Frankfurt. Early career, London. Maturity, New York. Zenith as pianist, 1910s. As composer, 1920s. Greatest hit, Country Gardens. Most monumental work, The Warriors, and Imaginary Ballet. Compositions are folk song settings, original works, or experimental works. Famous quote, "I hardly ever think of aught else but sex, race, athletics, speech and art. So that's my Grainger tweet, just to refresh your memory of some of the times and highlights of Percy Grainger. I'd like us to listen in a moment to Grainger playing his greatest hit, Country Gardens, but this recording is different. It's a recording from before he'd completed the work, when he was still trying some parts of it out. And so he went into the studios of the Columbia Graphophone Company. This is during the time when Grainger was actually in the American Army, playing in an American Army band, and he tried it out. And what I love about it is there are fistfuls of mistakes. He's slashing around, trying to figure out exactly what it is he still wants with this composition. And to my mind, you hear the greatness of Percy Grainger when he's playing around in this way. The technical facility is huge and the compositional ideas are pretty good. If one characteristic draws itself to my ear, it's he keeps on hammering out the middle parts, not the melody part or the bass part. He hammers out the notes in the middle of the texture. Let's listen now to Percy Grainger on the 7th of June 1918. That explains why we have the hiss. It's not some problem with the Gresham College hi-fi. It was once commented about Grainger that he liked to live dangerously as a pianist. He also explained pianism once as being like rock climbing, and I think he just slipped there a few times. But the tremendous sense of accelerating into the problems rather than pulling back from them is what's incredible about his pianism. This Grainger, largely home-educated by his mother, aspired to be a polymath with views on almost all topics of his day, including many entirely beyond his technical grasp. His views were often considered unconventional in his day, although not necessarily in ours. Let me give you a few examples. He did not normally wear a hat when it was normal to wear a hat. Reason? He said, it's bad for your hair. He wore his hair long. Reason? It keeps you warm. He ran rather than walked, even in polite circumstances, for instance, coming onto or off stage. Reason? It's good for you, and it cuts your profile as being the running pianist, by which he was widely known in America. Indeed, there's an instance once in the Sydney Town Hall where he realised he had about 45 seconds of break between the two solo items in a concerto. So he leapt from the stage, ran through the audience, touched the wall at the back of the hall, raced back, leapt back onto the stage and just caught the next entry. How embarrassing it would have been had he slipped. He carried his own suitcases and shopping, his reason being that it strengthens the hands, which is important for a pianist. He exposed himself naked to the sun and to cold winter air. Reason? It's good for the health and keeps infections at bay. He was, for much of his life, a vegetarian. Reason? It stops you having colds and it makes people respect all life more. And he invented his own special language called Nordic or Blue-Eyed English, in which words of Latin or Greek origin are absent. Reason? It restores to the English language its, as he imagined, pre-1066 Anglo-Saxon purity. So he talked about keyboard swinking instead of piano practicing, and referred to the telephone as a Thor juice talker. I'll just say that again. He referred to the telephone as a Thor juice talker. T-H-O-R. Okay, if you get that one, you're doing well. He invented various contraptions, such as the piano roller, reason that it meant the pianist could continually have the hands on the piano keyboard rather than every 2 pages having to turn it over. And some say that he invented the bra, and at least there are some very good drawings of the bra in 1908, 6 years before it was patented in the United States. I'm not suggesting that women in the last 10,000 years hadn't had a similar idea themselves, of course, but they hadn't actually patented it. Grainger even once speculated that this very diversity of his activity and his thoughts was just as important as his more circumscribed musical life, and wrote in 1917, quote, "My music expresses only certain sides in any event, and I almost think that my emotional life and the life of my thoughts have more to say than my artistic life, and will, in the future, be regarded as being of the same or greater significance." Put another way, we could say that Grainger aspired to a broader plane of all-roundedness. And that what deflected him from the singular concentration upon one particular musical vein could in fact be a reason why ultimately some would consider him not so great. Perhaps he was eventually defeated by the very multiplicity of his talents because he failed to channel any one of them sufficiently productively, or to tie them together to achieve something altogether greater than the sum of their parts. Now, most of the Grainger that we are hearing in the City of London Festival this year, and my goodness, there is a lot of it, is relatively short piano pieces, or pieces for wind, string or brass instruments. Most of these pieces last between 1 and 6 minutes, and most are in a direct or a pseudo-folk style. Australian Upcountry Song with the BB Singers last Friday. Or My Robin is to the Greenwood Gone with the National Ensemble last Monday. Or the jaunty Handel in the Strand. Then there are Piers Lane's performances of Grainger's fantastic piano transcriptions, including his Straussian Ramble on Love and Blithe Bells, his innovative setting of Bach's Sheep May Safely Graze. And there also, during these weeks, have been some little performed Grainger arrangements of medieval music. Alleluia Psalat or Beata Viscera, performed last week by the recorders and saxophones ensembles of the Guildhall School in St Andrew by the Wardrobe. Here is another from that set of works which Grainger arranged from the late medieval and early Renaissance period. So we now hear the Royal Northern College of Music Wind Orchestra, conducted by Clark Rundle, playing La Bernardina, which is a chanson by Josquin from about the year 1500. And so this is Grainger's engagement with early music, but bringing it up to date. multifarious works, whether originals or arrangements, did give Grainger considerable, mainly American-driven popularity. In the late 1910s and early 1920s, he was one of the most highly rated Steinway artists of his day. And two New York critics were prompted to observe in 1917, quote, "There is no figure in contemporary music more picturesque and prolific, none so elusive, perplexing, or inconsistent. A raw, uncouth physique glorified by some mysterious kind of inner radiance, a delegated spokesman for young lands and new peoples, a pagan Peter Pan, practical upon occasions as any plumber." Now, greatness refers to something more pushing of the boundaries than this, more inventive of new paradigms, something more avant-garde, freewheeling, hinting of something of genius, even perhaps the eccentric. For a music dictionary about the avant-garde, I found myself writing this a few years ago. I wrote, "Grainger's greatest avant-garde contribution lay in his lifelong search for a music free from the snobbish divisions of current musical classifications and full of soaring, floating sonorities, in contrast to the rigid angularities of pitch and rhythm found in most existing music. Some of the key inspirations to this quest were the malleability of nature itself, the muscular freedom of the poetry of Walt Whitman, Grieg's nature voices, the glissandi found in the music of Cyril Scott and such jazz artists as Duke Ellington, the microtones of the American composer Arthur Fickenshire, the riotous rhythms of Maori hakas and the joyous polyphony of Rarotongan singing. Grainger saw parallel developments to his conception of a free music in the work of Sigmund Freud and Albert Einstein, the growing passions of his day for flying and speed, and the replacement of faith in a beneficent deity with, quote, the fearless all-embracingness of science. In 1938, Grainger commented that the art of music had not yet grown up and likened its contemporary conditions to Egyptian bas reliefs in which only regularised shapes are found, as against the condition of free music, which for him paralleled Greek sculptures, where all aspects and attitudes of the human body could be shown in arrested movement. Now, you can see from that paragraph that Grainger's ideas about music went far beyond the glossy, sometimes twee settings of folk songs like his renowned Danny Boy setting. There was something deeper, a craving for the flexibility that electronic music now allows to us. But he was born half a century before his time. An early stimulus to Grainger's ideal of tonal freedom was the wave movements that he observed in the sea near Melbourne and in its Albert Park Lake during the late 1880s and early 1890s. His inclination for rhythmic freedoms was heightened in the late 1890s by his analysis of speech rhythms of passages from the Old Testament, leading to the irregular rhythms of his love verses from the Song of Solomon, sketched when he was aged 17, and furthered in his Scottish-influenced Hillsong No. 1 when he was 19. And then there are the multiplicity of rhythms generated by a lurching Italian train in 1900 that provided the impetus for his train music, written when he was just 18. We'll now listen to his train music, which he never quite completed. He intended it for a huge orchestra of 150. So we have this miniature piece in a version by Elban Rathbun, and here it's performed by the City of Birmingham Symphony Orchestra, conducted by Simon Rattle. This is Grainger at age 18. And that's it. I once thought it might be better called Noddy Goes to the Seaside. But a wonderful work showing the formlessness, but also the constant sound of the train ticking along there for nearly all of that piece as it went along its rails. By the time he was 20, when Grainger wrote his essay, My Musical Outlook, he knew what had to be done. It was necessary to clear away all structural and formal limitations, regularity of bars and beats and phrases, themes, motives and sections. He saw them just as barring the way to the realisation of his freer style ideals. Grainger believed in a music that was an expression of emotion. In his music, his emotion. And so he rejected the artificial contrasts of themes and keys which superficially structured most classical or romantic music. But how was this to be done? What Grainger wanted above all was consistency of texture. You hear that in that piece, a consistency of the musical texture, even if it risked becoming blandly uniform. He once said that actually the musical equivalent in geography was the Nullarbor Desert in Australia, something that was just gloriously and perfectly uniform. That's one way of looking at that. In a letter to the Scottish critic, D.C. Parker, in 1916, he elaborated his distinctive view of texture. It always seems to me, he wrote, that the texture of a composer is the determining factor of his work. What is texture? Is it sodden texture, like linoleum, or a bright, hard shell-like texture, like Chinese porcelain? Is it transparent texture, like Bach, Debussy and Chopin, or a muddy texture? So what exactly was Grainger's definition of texture? In the same letter he explained it like this, and I'll just get a little technical for a moment. He said, texture is the actual distribution of notes in chords, the critical or unconscious choice of the inversions, whether they are close or whether they are spread. In short, the weft of the fabric, the actual stuff, the sonority produced by the many parts or by a chordy style of writing. And what's more, saying the same thing in a more popular way, for me, he said, the question is, how does such a chord, how does such a passage tickle or grate upon or smooth out my ear when I listen? How do the ant-like armies of polyphonous parts move as they go about their business? Can one trace their paths, or are their movements hid in fog? In fact, in another writing, he talks about that tracking of the vehicle going around Hyde Park Corner, and says his music would be a really busy Hyde Park Corner, maybe 5 o'clock on a Friday, and all the different vehicles coming in at different points and going out at others and jostling and really a maelstrom of activity. That's the musical image he had. And then he went on to say, do the movements of these parts jostle and rub and irritate one another? Comments, I love my parts to jostle and rub and irritate. Or do they glow together like glorious passages in Wagner and Brahms? In short, to Grainger, fine personal texture never ages. Here now is my favourite example of a Grainger folk song setting that is very imaginative indeed and illustrates Grainger's own fine personal texture at its very best. The original tune, Rufford Park Poachers, as part of the Lincolnshire Posy Suite, was a complex one, both in its musical characteristics and its text, which is about the poaching of game on a private reserve. Grainger has turned it into a weird work in which the sense of beat and key are completely broken down. Sometimes they just disappear. It's a proto-free music. Listen for the ending passage, which almost sounds deranged, and for the masterly way in which Grainger writes for the wind band, reflecting his years in the American Army bands. We're listening now to Rufford Park Poachers, Royal Northern College of Music Wind Orchestra again, this time conducted by Timothy Renish. So Rufford Park Poachers, a tune collected by Grainger in the early years of the century, actually in Lincolnshire, but set then during his American years in the 1930s. Grainger was driven by a democratic aim in music. He developed the concept of elastic scoring in the 1920s so that music could be played whatever the available instrumental resources. That is, the connection between a particular part and a particular instrument was sacrificed to a more flexible concept of tonal balance. So almost all available instruments could be used, provided players were assigned their parts with an ear to the way in which the instruments blended. But this democratised music was, as Grainger explained in 1931, only a halfway house on the road to free music. Music in which all intervals, rhythms, harmonies and forms will be free, irregular, unlimited and non-conventional. Then only, he wrote, will the full soul of man find universal, untrammelled musical speech. Just what he had been hankering for since 1902, in fact. Hence, in the early months of 1935, Grainger launched his Free Music No. 1, one of the earliest examples of gliding music. It was scored for string quartet, but he believed his free music really demanded non-human performance, so that the composer could speak to his public directly without the intervening tyranny of the performer. Free Music No. 1 and a sequel, Free Music No. 2, in 1937, were then scored for ensembles of theremins, early electronic instruments with variable volume and timbre, which emitted a single frequency determined by the distance of the performer's hand in relation to an antenna. If you wonder what that sounds like, it's a bit like Doctor Who. Let's now listen to the string quartet version of his early free music, here played by members of the Academy of St Martin in the Fields Chamber Ensemble. This is on the Chandos collected edition of Grainger's works. Let's listen to Free Music, 1935. So back to our topic. Was Percy Grainger the greatest Australian composer? Well, was he a composer? I think we'll have to say yes. But he was a lot more besides. With some 400 compositions to his credit, as well as some 3,000 concert performances, many involving his own works, he would be hard to knock out on that technical score. Was he great? And specifically as a composer? Well, he certainly was popular in his day, but his folk song arrangements alone would not conclusively make the case of greatness. And his original compositions do strengthen the case, but it still isn't quite sufficient in my opinion. To my mind, what pushes him into the truly great category was his conception of this irregular, formless, what he called unforeknowable nature music. And we've heard that in the last three examples in one form or another. And that even though he didn't live to push this idea through to its final fruition. Next, was he Australian? Technically not. In 1882, when he was born, Australia didn't exist. So he was born as a British subject resident in the self-governing colony of Victoria. So he's a Victorian. Those self-governing colonies federated in 1901, creating Australia, by which time Grainger had already decamped to Germany. And he only returned to Australia twice before, in 1918, he became an American citizen and hence at that time had to relinquish all other citizenships. But he always considered himself an Australian. But like most Australian artists to this day, expatriatism was a virtual necessity if you were to achieve any kind of international success. In fact, there's a beautiful moment in the film about Grainger called Passion, the film that came out in 1999. And the fictionalised Grainger there says of Australia that it is, quote, a place where civilisation seems a walloping waste of time. And his fictionalised mother, even better, says this, Australia, the best place on earth. And then continues, the problem is that you just can't live there. Now, from Stephen Loam's book of 1999 called When London Calls, the expatriation of Australian creative artists to Britain, you would even gain the not incorrect impression that London was actually the hub of professional musical life, both for Australia and New Zealand, until well into the 1960s. If you were good enough, you took the boat to London to test your talent as early as you could. And if you were good enough, you stayed there. If you went home, you had obviously failed. Now, where Grainger was different was that, driven by the outbreak of the First World War, he sidestepped to North America, as also did, somewhat later, his younger Australian contemporaries Arthur Benjamin, who's had many years in Vancouver, and Peggy Glanville Hicks in New York. And there in New York, Grainger stayed, and there he died, just weeks after John F. Kennedy became the president. So now we have the integrated proposition. Was Percy Grainger Australia's great test composer? If we are prepared to admit that no Australian composer comes close to any list of the top 100 composers globally, or even the top 100 20th century composers, or even the top 100 living composers, and all of those do seem to be true by virtually any score, then Grainger's case is about as good as any Australian's on the title. The evidence of this year's City of London Festival, with its strong Australian and New Zealand accent, also strengthens the case. Out of 21 Australian composers represented in the festival's programs, Grainger scores the greatest playing time by far, including 1 half program and 2 whole programs, along with 2 lectures and an exhibition, of course. And I do hope that you will come to the performance of one of his masterly improvisatory works called Random Round, which the Elision Ensemble is playing on Friday at 6 o'clock, as well as at 7:30 on that day, the 2 piano recital at 2 Temple Place, where you can also view that exhibition. But who else is there in the aspiringly greatest Australian camp? Age does not seem to weary them, nor the years condemn. For after the 15 concert segments in this year's festival to Grainger, the next most popular Australian composer is Peter Joshua Sculthorpe, born in Tasmania in the 1920s. And then after that we move towards the youngsters, with Brett Dean, born in Brisbane in the 1960s, and after that a cluster of 4 others. Carl Vine, born in Perth, Matthew Hinson, born in Wollongong, Elena Katz-Chernin, born in Tashkent, and David Lumsden, born in Sydney, though resident here in Britain. So it's just interesting to plot there are hardly any dead Australian composers other than Percy Grainger in this festival. Indeed, there are only 2 that I could see, Dorian Le Gallienne and Malcolm Williamson, master of the Queen's music during the 80s and 90s, yet represented in this festival by just 1 short work. Now, this is a very inexact science to take 1 festival, but this year's result is undoubtedly skewed by another factor. 2011 is the 50th anniversary of Grainger's death. Hence, Grainger is gaining an extra promotion this year. But if you looked at the other indicators of greatness, density of scholarly books, or frequency of radio broadcasts, I think you'll find that Grainger still holds up very well against all comers. So, is Percy Grainger Australia's greatest composer? I think he is. And he's also one of America's and Britain's better ones as well. What's more, many would see him definitely in the top 100 of the last century's pianists. He was a truly talented man, and I look forward now to learning some of your views about this contentious topic. Thank you.
I don't expect you to remember this, but in the early 1960s, there was a recording of English Country Garden by, I think it was Don Rogers. Was that just pure coincidence that came out about the time of Percy Grainger's death, or was it actually coordinated? It couldn't be planned, but did one follow the other? I always remember that because I shared a room with a chap called Dave Robbins, and in the actual song it said, "Robins, don't forget the robins," and he always took great exception that this, they talked about the birds in the English Country Garden.
Yeah. I don't know that exact recording, but what is amazing is how frequently Country Gardens has been recorded. I think one of the most beautiful recent ones is one recorded by the English Country Gardener Orchestra, conducted by Gardner. So yeah, it's certainly been recorded many times, but I don't recall that particular one.
Percy Grainger was in London up to 1914, and that time the Australian High Commission was being built in the Strand. It started to be built. His composition Handel in the Strand, was that composed at that time, and how did it get its name? Why Handel and why in the Strand?
I have to say, just off the top of my head, I don't remember the answer to the second part, but yes,
why did it get its name Handel in the
yes,
Strand?
yes, I can't remember. It's a clog dance.
Yes.
And I find that's a rudimentary start, and maybe someone else can help me here. The connection with the High Commission is exactly right. I think the High Commission was built between about 1911 and 1913 as a building.
Yes.
Yeah, and that, as I recall, because the centenary of the diplomatic representation in Australia was, I think, end of 2009, beginning of 2010. But I don't think it had anything to do with it, no.
You mentioned Duke Ellington. Was there any actual musical relationship or connection between the two of them at all? Did they ever play each other's music or play together? Or?
I don't know if Ellington played any Grainger, but the connection was definitely when, in 1932 to 33, Grainger was the head of the music department at New York University. He ran a big general music course, and during that he invited Duke Ellington to come and play. Students were quite impressed, I gather. Yeah, so they did meet, and he also was very interested in the whole concept of jazz, because to his idea, jazz was something that had, to some degree, lost its way in becoming a stylized rhythm, and he very much liked those people who could keep the more strongly improvisatory nature of jazz. Obviously, Duke Ellington wasn't bad at that.
I don't know where I read it, but I thought there was some idea that Balfour Gardiner suggested Handel. It was like Handel running down the Strand or something like that. Is that so?
Yes.
I think it was something of that sort.
Well,
and so he incorporated it into, he called it clog dance to start with. I
yes.
think it's it's on the notes before the piano.
Yes. Well, certainly that connection would be right for the time.
Yeah. Yes.
It would be definitely right, yes. There was a question over here, by the way, from earlier on, if we could, that's the third row down.
I think it's true that in this country we tend to see Grainger as English because of his connection with English folk song. But he spent the greater part of his life in the USA, and I wondered if you could comment on how the Americans actually view him.
It's a big topic, and if you looked at the book that David Pear and I have edited called The All-Round Man, which is a collection of Grainger's letters from his American years, you'll see some very strong themes there. He felt that he made many British friends. In fact, he made most of them when he was a student in Germany, like Henry Balfour, for instance, and also Herman Sandby, who was Danish, and Roger Quilter, who was British. And so he formed some very strong British friends, and that's why he definitely wanted to come to London as soon as he stopped being a student. Going to America in 1914, with some sense of criticism for having fled the country from some of the critics here in Britain, he immediately jumped to a completely higher level musically in New York, and he remained there for about 10 or 20 years. As a result, he didn't make the friends. To sit on the pinnacle of a musical career is often a very lonely place. So he wrote about 25 years after having gone to America that he felt he'd never really made friends in America. He had many people who were acquaintances, many people who were professional colleagues. So he did consider the British were much more eccentric than the Americans, and he liked that. But he also considered that the Americans had a freewheeling democratic sense that he could never find in Britain. David Vermont.
Who owns the copyright, and did he do well financially? And about Handel in the Strand, as a former chairman of the London Handel Society, I ought to know, but I don't. But it's always taken together with Handel in the Strand and Bach Goes to Town. He didn't write Bach Goes to Town, I don't think.
No,
but I don't know if it had any sort of musical connection.
Yes, I'm not he definitely didn't write Bach, no. The copyright is owned by the International Grainger Society, having been assigned by the Grainger's wife's second husband, who is still alive and living in New York. In olden times, 50 years after the death of the composer, as we have this year, the works would go out of copyright, but of course copyright periods have been extended in most, but not all parts of the world. So in most, but not all parts of the world, you still have various copyright restrictions. I believe New Zealand has not yet fallen in with the longer copyright periods and may still have 50 years. So you can probably go and play some of these pieces in New Zealand if you want.
Did Grainger go on to arrange some of these free music pieces for mechanical means? I've got some recollection that later in his life, some sort of not electronic, but maybe mechanical means were used to produce that music.
Yes, he continued to develop these ideas and had some very large and lumbering machines in his living room for the last 15 years of his life. One of them was called the S.D. Reed Tone Tool, that's in his blue-eyed English, of course, which was a reed machine. One was called the Kangaroo Pouch Tone Tool. I won't elaborate that, you can probably imagine it hopping along. And his last one, not quite completed at his death, was called the Electric Eye Tone Tool, in which photocells read the changing amount of light admitted to a slit by the hills and dales of Grainger's graphs, and turns this information into sound emitted from loudspeakers. So he was trying to get this sense of gliding, malleable, formless music, rather than the sharp angles of pitch leaps or definite rhythmic conjunctions.
This is just an observation, but presumably Grainger's own testament to his Australianness was borne out in the establishment of his museum in Melbourne. Would you agree?
Maybe. Grainger rather liked to found museums. And he did found one at the University of Melbourne, and it was built in 2 stages in the 1930s. But he also, until 1944, harboured the view of having one in Adelaide, in the home of his Aunt Clara. And when she died in 1944, he did want to turn it into a museum too, but then he thought, well, no, maybe it'd be better to sell it off. But he did look at having museums also in the United States, and deposited various collections of materials. His view was that if there are great wars and conflagrations, it's good to scatter the stuff around a bit. So he was always trying to make 5 copies of everything. And in some regard that wasn't a bad idea, because as we now try to gather them all together, if you can't find them in Australia, there are various deposits in the Library of Congress, with some friends he had out in Oregon or Washington. In the middle of the Second World War, he actually went and lived in Springfield, Missouri, because he wanted to be as far away from the coast as possible, in case either the Germans or the Japanese actually invaded. And so he packaged up all of his materials and deposited them in further libraries at that time. So maybe it isn't an absolutely conclusive test, but the fact that he did put it in Melbourne, his birthplace, did say something either about the importance of Grainger, the importance of Australia to Grainger. Alternatively, it was the only university gullible enough to agree to do it.
So now I hope you'll all get yourselves down to 2 Temple Place, which is just off Victoria Embankment. The exhibition is open from 11 until 5 every day. And if you can go on Wednesday at 1 o'clock, you have the added bonus of a free guided tour, so do that. Our next City of London Festival lecture is here tomorrow, and it's by Richard Nuns, and it's called something that I can't pronounce and don't intend to try, because I know we have some Australian visitors here, so I'm not going to make too much of a fool of myself. But full details are in the programme. Do take the City of London Festival programme away with you if you haven't got one. And also, please take next year's Gresham College lecture programme with you too. And we do hope you can join us afterwards for a glass of wine, which will be served just next door. And now, will you please join me in thanking Professor Gillies for a brilliant lecture. Thank you so much.